Okay, this is Economic Nationalism, Objective 1, Part 1, about the American economy, the foundations of the American agricultural economy prior to the Civil War. And prior to 1800, the economy is basically dominated by the tobacco industry. Okay, across the board, Jamestown, various other settlements, tobacco is a thing that dominates American agriculture. Now, the tobacco industry grew because of this guy you see here in the picture. His name is John Rolfe, and yes, he is the husband of Pocahontas. In 1612, he actually figured out a way to take the bitterness out of tobacco. Basically, when you raise it, you'd chop it down, you'd cure it, and get rid of the bitterness by hanging it out to dry. You'd essentially toast it, roast it, whatever the case may be. Now, basically, when Rolfe figures out how to do this, tobacco, nobody was really interested in tobacco before this because of the bitterness that was involved with the taste, and no one really wanted to smoke it, that type of thing. But Rolfe's methods and his discovery of how to do it basically saved the Virginia colony. What you started to see was that crops were planted in the streets of Jamestown, even between gravestones. Now, they imported some food because they had to. Most of the people in Jamestown, once they figured out that tobacco could be very profitable, were more interested in planting tobacco than they were corn or vegetables or other types of crops. So everybody was growing tobacco. Everybody was trying to get wealthy, and everybody needed to import food in order to survive and live. This is basically what they did. Now, as a result, there was a huge demand for more and more land to plant more of king nicotine, as it was called, and colonists start pushing further and further into the frontier. Now, that's going to bring along a series of problems with that. Sooner or later, we're going to have a surplus of tobacco. That's going to lower the price. By 1700, there were 40 million pounds per year of tobacco being grown. But despite the falling prices and the surplus of tobacco, the response was to simply grow more tobacco. That created some environmental problems because extensive tobacco farming exhausts the soil and can ruin the soil. But with this being their only cash crop, everybody decided that the only answer was to continue growing more tobacco. Now, that's going to create a series of labor problems. The birth rate in the colonies was very low during this time, and African labor was scarce and very expensive. Remember, this is prior to slavery becoming really, really big in the colonies. So since African labor was scarce and expensive, they had to figure something else out. Also, Native Americans were too susceptible to disease, so they really didn't know what they were going to do for a labor force. You can see the chart here. Here's the disbursement of slaves to various areas for various things. A lot of them were in the New England colonies. A lot of them were in the Chesapeake colonies, the colonies that were located right in the middle here. And a bunch of them were on indigo and rice farms in the South. So Africans and Native Americans couldn't be really counted on. The answer, it turned out, was to be with indentured servants. Now, indentured servants were displaced workers and farmers who were coming to the colonies from England. On the average, they'd work for 4 to 7 years on a tobacco farm, longer if they were misbehaving in some way. And for working those 4 to 7 years, they got free passage to the New World, usually an axe and a hoe, some corn, a suit, and possibly some land when their service ended. That was the thing they basically all dreamed about, was that they'd get some land of their own once they fulfilled their obligations of someone bringing them over to the New World. But they were indentured to that person. They were obligated to that person. So over the course of time, about 100,000 of what became known as the quote-unquote white slaves by 1700 are 75% from the Virginia, Maryland area, the Chesapeake area. Most of them would end up being pretty frustrated, mostly by failed dreams, the lack of women that were in the colonies to marry and start families with, and they were also upset that they had taken away their right to vote in 1670 because the government determined that they had very little interest in the country. In fact, a lot of them had interest in the country. They wanted to stay there and have land of their own. Now, the other side of this, of the indentured servant system, is the headright system. And the headright system, the people who were the headrights, or had the headrights, were those who paid the passage for an indentured servant to come to the New World. Now, according to the local governments, if you were willing to pay passage for an indentured servant, the government would give you 50 acres. So as you can imagine, this started a bit of a land aristocracy in Virginia. These people became known as the FFVs, or the First Families of Virginia. Basically, they promoted indentured servitude because, they would get 50 acres from the government. And the government was saying, you're providing us with a labor force when African Americans and Native Americans really can't be that force. So everybody felt it worked out pretty well. The problem was that it promoted indentured servitude, and more indentured servants came to America, but the master got most of the benefits. Because the master was being given 50 acres for bringing an indentured servant here, they kept bringing more and more, and prime land started becoming scarce, so the masters were the ones who kept the best land. Penniless at the end of servitude, many indentured servants went back to work for masters at extremely low wages. Now in the South, prior to 1800, agricultural society was a little bit different. The spread of slavery led to a small group of wealthy planters who owned vast amounts of land and many slaves to work it. Again, we're talking about the FFVs, the First Families of Virginia. Among them were the Fitzhughs, the Lees, and the Washingtons. George Washington's family was among the First Families of Virginia. This is a picture of Mount Vernon, the mansion that was eventually established by the Washington family later on in the earlier 1700s. Now, the FFVs came to dominate the Virginia economy and the government. 70% of the Virginia House of Burgesses were made up of FFVs, First Families of Virginia, and they had mansions like this with extensive libraries and lived a wealthy lifestyle. But what most people don't realize about the FFVs, like George Washington's family, is that they were very businesslike, hardworking farmers. Now, most small farmers were the largest social group. They tilled modest plots with 1 or 2 slaves. This was a step above the landless former indentured servants, who were a step above the current indentured servants and slaves. So the small farmers made up that biggest social group. Now, there were also very poor roads in the early South. Waterways became many a source of transportation. The roads were so bad that funeral parties couldn't get to burial grounds in bad weather, and that led to the Southern tradition of family burial plots on their own land. That's something that you still see down there today. So they just buried them on their own property because the roads didn't really allow them to get people to a graveyard. In the beginning in the South, most of it was like this. There were very few cities and very few professions like lawyers, bankers, etc. Society for all social classes basically revolved around agriculture. Now, in terms of Southern agriculture from 1800 to the Civil War, prior to the cotton gin, just setting this up, because the cotton gin is the thing that's going to make the big difference. Prior to the cotton gin in 1793, cotton was very scarce and expensive. It was a main reason that it was a full day's work to pull 1 pound of the lint from 3 pounds of seed. Now, if you take a look at this bale of cotton, imagine how much time it would take to just get 1 pound of lint, or get enough lint here, how many pounds of seed that would take to make that happen, and how much time that would take to have that take place. Well, Eli Whitney changes everything with the cotton gin in 1793. They called it the cotton gin because it was short for the cotton engine. Whitney was a Yale graduate and managed to build it in 10 days to solve the poverty issue in the South. He was actually going down there to be a tutor and a lawyer, but when he saw the conditions down there, especially with the cotton trade, he thought there would be a way to help. Now, his cotton gin made a lot more efficiency in taking out the seeds, as you can see in the diagram here. And that in turn led to cotton mass production. You could come up with multiple bales of hay. I mean, it was so much faster than anything they had ever done before that the South was now mass producing cotton. The cotton gin was revolutionary to Southern agricultural production, but it was also revolutionary in another way. The cotton gin may have actually created the massive amount for slavery in the South between 1800 and the Civil War. Because you could mass produce so much cotton, you needed a lot of cotton picked. and now huge amounts of labor were needed, and that meant many, many more slaves than they'd ever had before. In essence, the King Cotton Revolution that hits the South became very, very successful, even if it was socially unacceptable in terms of the slavery. The biggest thing about the cotton was that it didn't ruin the soil, and because it didn't ruin the soil, you could keep replanting in the same spot. You didn't have to expand your land out. You could stay in the places you were, and if you got more land, that just meant more cotton. Now, as a result, the profits were better that way. You didn't have to expand your land if you wanted to, and the turnover was pretty quick. It was quicker profits than tobacco. By the time we get to this time period leading up to the Civil War, the American South is producing 50% of the world's cotton. So from 1800 to 1860, the economy takes a pretty dramatic shift from tobacco to cotton production. Now, once again, this is going to lead to a plantation aristocracy that exists in the South. At the time, only 1,700 families living in big mansions like this, with sprawling land and beautiful scenery, 1,700 families owned more than 100 slaves in the Civil War. Now, that seems like a bit of a misnomer because whenever you think of the South, you think of big plantations and lots of slaves. But this minority of people, only 1,700 families owning more than 100 slaves by the Civil War, dominate Southern society and politics from their huge mansions and their plantations that they live on. As it would turn out, and this chart's kind of blurred, but it turns out you can see the numbers here. About the top one right up here is supposed to be 1,700 owning 100 or more slaves. There were basically 345,000 families in the South who owned fewer than 100 slaves, all told when you add the numbers up, by the time of the Civil War. The vast majority of people owned fewer than 10 slaves and were considered small farmers. Basically, 75% of Southern whites owned no slaves at all by the Civil War, and again, lived in the backcountry and the mountains, raising livestock mostly, not cotton. Okay, thank you very much.